Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly grim, dark psychodrama, a fable known as Dark Camelot. Now, we're going to be navigating through what the source material calls the Permanent Night. So I want you to think of this not just as some standard fantasy setting, but more like a graphic novel tour of the human mind undergoing a really profound, agonizing transformation. We're using a Fichtean dialectic model to expand on this story today. We've got some incredibly striking concepts to help visualize this dense, psychological fable, so let's just jump right in. Imagine your own mind watched over by this chilling, detached presence. The absolute core of our journey is defined by the quote you see here, "the eye that does not turn away." This silent witness literally transforms the glass library of your mind into a dark theater of despair. It just sits there, watching you grapple with the heavy metallic burden of what the text calls silver guilt. So this isn't just a story about monsters hiding in the dark, you know? It's about the monsters of our own internal logic and the silent, unblinking audience that watches us fight them.
Okay, part one, the subverted superego, the thesis.
So, let's establish our Fichtean thesis. Our starting point is the fragile human mind, right? Desperately clinging to traditional philosophies and old ways of thinking just to protect itself from the dark. But up on the jagged spires of the glass library sits the crow. Now, what's fascinating here is that the crow isn't just a bird. It acts as a wildly subverted superego and the zeitgeist, the wandering spirit of the times. Normally, your superego is your moral compass. But not here. Instead of guiding you, the crow just watches, its oily feathers shimmering in the gloom, perfectly documenting your descent as a totally detached, observing consciousness.
Moving on to part two, reaping the black harvest, the antithesis.
Right, so if our thesis is the mind clinging to tradition, our antithesis is its violent breakdown into dark, cynical knowledge. This is where the crow conducts what's called the black harvest. It literally feeds on the despair and failed philosophies of these so-called higher men. And to put this into perspective, contrast this with the Jester's Sapphire Forge operations. While the Jester aggressively burns down illusions in the forge, the crow is much more passive. It just gathers up discarded negative energy like black grain. Stuff like the secret shame of the Pale Inquisitor, the sterile, useless data of the Last Thinker, and the predatory revenge of the Tarantula Preacher. As the traveler analyzes these monumental failures of human thought, the resulting despair practically saturates the earth.
Part 3. The Architecture of Despair.
Now, to really grasp the scale of what's happening here, we need to compare it to the Jester's operations. The Jester extracts what's known as narrative inertia on a massive, cosmic scale. To simplify that for a second, narrative inertia is just what happens when the universe itself completely runs out of story energy and just stalls out, stops moving forward. But the crow's work is intimately personal. While the Jester is out there mining the universe stalling out, the crow is meticulously building an internal architecture of psychic despair. It's ensuring that the heavy weight of your very specific failures and your own nihilistic logic is devastatingly accounted for.
Which brings us to part 4, flesh born from despair.
So as all this internal despair saturates the earth, it reaches a terrifying critical mass. And look at how this builds across the timeline. The crow traces this truly agonizing evolution. First, it starts out as a mere spiritual observer, just hanging out up on those spires. Then, through that black harvest we talked about, it accumulates an incredibly dense amount of psychic energy. And finally, the boundary between your internal thought and external reality just wears completely thin. It breaks down. The crow materializes into actual physical flesh, evolving from a silent register of the cost into a very real physical judge of souls.
Part 5. The Violet Verdict, the Collision.
All right, we've reached the climax of our Fichtean dialectic, the ultimate collision at the vacant throne. Imagine your internal god of memory taking on a tangible, incredibly heavy physical weight. All your past, your history, your foundational thoughts, they're all dragged directly to the chopping block, right under the watchful eyes of the physical crow and the violet knight.
Next, your god of reason. The very logic and rationality you've relied on to survive and make sense of the world, forcefully brought forward, standing completely defenseless in this dark theater of despair.
And finally, your will, your drive, your ambition, your personal agency. Laid out there in the gloom, right beside memory and reason, perfectly prepped for a transformative strike.
And this brings us to the actual execution, the strike of the violet gavel. When this gavel falls, delivering what the text hauntingly calls its bruised verdict, you have to understand, it isn't just a sentence made of words. It is a violent, physical, transformative event.
It crushes these internal gods, memory, reason, and will, violently together. It forces you, the traveler, to look directly at the screaming shadow within your own divided soul, and through it all, the crow watches, unblinkingly, as the core pillars of your psyche are entirely shattered.
Part 6. Regression or grave dance. The synthesis.
Which leaves us with our ultimate Fichtean synthesis, the final documented outcome of what is created from the broken pieces of your mind. The gavel forces your total intellectual despair to collide with your basic feral need to survive. And that leaves you with two distinct paths. On one side, you have total regression. This is where your psyche just shatters completely and you regress into a feral man-beast consumed by the permanent night. But on the other side, you have the grave dance. To simplify this concept, the grave dance is essentially a creative rebellion. It's coming to terms with the fact that your old mind is dead, but actively choosing to dance in the ruins and generate your own light anyway. The crow's entire purpose is only fulfilled when it witnesses exactly which of these two paths you take in this final ceremony.
So, I'll leave you with this final, provocative takeaway from the fable of Dark Camelot. When your traditional human thinking finally fails to protect your mind, when your memory, reason, and will are completely crushed by the gavel, what savage new purpose will you forge from the wreckage? Will you let the dark consume you, or will you learn the grave dance? Really think on that the next time you feel the weight of your own internal logic. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the architecture of your own thoughts.